Torment Tides of Numenera is In Exile's attempt at making a spiritual successor to Planescape Torment, but does it match up to the groundbreaking Planescape Torment itself? Yes and no. Now, Tides of Numenera is not really a sequel in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't pick off where Planescape Torment left off at all. Instead, it really carries the original philosophical ideas of the original game. It has deep, engaging conversation and dialogue options, with a very interesting and weird world, very much like the original Planescape Torment. Now, Tides of Numenera is set in a RPG tabletop setting of Numenera. It's basically sort of a futuristic setting in some ways, with sci-fi gadgets and powers mixed with high fantasy. It takes place in basically a far future in which civilizations have arisen and fallen, and there's all sorts of technology scattered across the land that nobody really knows how to use because it's from some ancient civilization from thousands of years ago. And that's really where the name comes in, Numenera, which is a reference to old technology from long past civilizations. You play as the last cast off of the Changing God, who is someone that can transfer their consciousness between different bodies. Each time they leave a body, they leave an empty vessel of a person that then becomes its own independent person of the actual Changing God, and they become then known as cast-offs. Much of the game is centered around your relationship to the Changing God and what it means to be a cast-off. Some people will hate you for it. Some people will think that you were responsible in some way, shape, or form for what the Changing God did to them. Some people will love you. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the story of the game to avoid spoilers, but I'll say that unfortunately the ending of the game is a huge disappointment. It takes an absolute nosedive, and it ends very abruptly at a point that feels very unfinished. Now, in general, the writing is pretty decent in this game. In some ways, it actually far exceeds Pillars of Eternity with some very interesting characters and very interesting backgrounds and tons of options to choose how do you want to play or interact with characters. But there's also some parts where it gets really, really bad. And this can, in many ways, make the game feel like it was rushed or unfinished. Much like other games in the RPG sphere, it also has bits and pieces where there's voice acting, so sometimes characters will go from voice acting to not voice acting, and sometimes it's really, really bad, like total amateur hour. Now, moving on to music and sound, the game's music suits the game very well. It has that kind of odd, weird, mystical feeling to it that really suits the game's overall backdrop. Sound is an area, though, where the game kind of does drop the ball, especially when it comes to combat. There just isn't a lot of oomph or power here at all. It doesn't sound very engaging. Graphically, it's an area where Torment Tides of Numenera does a really good job at capturing that style and feeling of the game. You've got all sorts of weird, interesting locations and that mixture of that high fantasy and technology, especially when it comes to some of the weird areas, like there's this city that's built inside of a beast, basically, and then there's a traditional normal city, and then you've got these weird wizard-like areas and this high technology areas that are covered by shields. There's all sorts of really interesting different locations, and they're really well brought to life. Now, character development and combat I'm going to lump together, and they're one area where I do feel this game really drops the ball. Now, there's three different classes in Torment Tides of Numenera. You've got the Glaive, which is like a traditional warrior class, the Jack, that's a jack of all trades, basically, and then you've got the Nano, which is sort of like a wizard class. All three of these classes sort of go towards different aspects of the game's stat pool. There's three stats. There's might, speed, and intellect, and each of these are used basically throughout the game to do different things, such as if you get stuck in an area, you can use might to move an object, or speed to maybe jump over it, or intellect to maybe move it with your mind or something like that. There's all sorts of weird different powers, or you might have an area where you're talking to an NPC, and maybe you can bully him with might, or you can use intellect to try and talk him out of a situation, and stuff like that. Now, that's really cool and all, but unfortunately these exact three stats are used for combat, which means you can get stuck in weird situations where you burnt all your points trying to move objects or convince people to do things, and maybe you can't rest or you don't have any items to replenish your points, so then you either have to decide to run back or you have to sit there and slog through combat, which is really boring because you can't do any spells or abilities, so then you're just doing basic attacks for like no damage at all. It's just boring. And they could have fixed this system by maybe making it easier to replenish these stats or something like that. Now, we haven't really dug that deeply into combat, but combat is basically done in a turn-based system. You can describe it as pretty rudimentary at best. It's really boring, it's not very engaging or interesting, there's no real impact or oomph to attacks, so they don't feel very exciting, they're not very flashy visually at all, and so it's really just boring. And the game does a really bad job when it comes to informing you as a player of how you can make different decisions in combat, such as if I want to move a character from here to here, it's not very clear how much points it's going to cost me right off the bat, compared to a game like, say, XCOM, for example, where it's very clear where it takes this many squares that I have to move or something like that to use my points to then attack an enemy. And that can get really irritating because you can get stuck in these weird situations where it's not very clear, can I make it to this spot? Can I not make it to this spot? So then you have to just sit there wailing your mouse around the place trying to find a spot that you can move to, or trying to find out you have points or so forth. Now, fortunately, you don't really have to partake in the combat that often. You can talk yourself out of most situations either by using those might, speed, or intellect, but sometimes you do run out of it, like I mentioned before, and then you're just forced into combat, and it is a real drag every time you're in combat, which is a real shame because oftentimes these RPG games are built around having interesting and engaging combat systems. Now, overall, as a whole, Torment Tides of Numenera gets a 7 out of 10. It's not a bad game, but this is a game I would not recommend buying for full price. You have to buy it if you're interested on sale, because this game just isn't good enough. The story leaves at a very abrupt, annoying point. The combat is really boring. The character development just really isn't there. It's just not the greatest game, and there's a lot of better games out there that you can play. But that isn't to say it's a bad game either, because it does have a very interesting story despite the fact that it has a really bad ending point, and it does have some really interesting mechanics, such as allowing you to talk your way out of most situations, which isn't really possible in a lot of different RPGs. So in the end, just wait for a sale, unless you're absolutely dying to play the game.